Not many people know the process of canning, but I remember days when Grandma was canning tomatoes. The aroma still lives rent-free in my nose. Your grandma may have passed down a trick or two, but what about the secrets she forgot? Allow me to teach you the best canning secrets she forgot to share. In the early days of home canning, ingenuity was key, and that's where the upside-down canning method rolled in. This unconventional technique involved filling jars, sealing them tightly, and flipping them over while still hot. The idea was to let gravity and heat create a vacuum seal. While it may sound practical, it was a product of its time, long before modern guidelines made food safety a science, not a gamble. Rooted in the resourcefulness of the 19th and early 20th centuries, this method allowed families to preserve fruits and jams quickly, saving space and time. It was especially popular in rural areas, where simplicity reigned, and there wasn't a USDA inspector for miles. But here's the catch. Modern experts consider it outdated, warning that it doesn't reliably kill bacteria like botulism spores. Turns out some old-school hacks belong in the history books, not your kitchen. Still, there's something to admire in its cultural impact. For generations, it symbolized frugality, efficiency, and trust in time-tested methods. Back then, food was survival, not a Pinterest board. Today, while safer techniques like water bath and pressure canning have taken over, the upside-down method remains a reminder of how far preservation has come. Believe it or not, some canners once looked to the night sky for guidance. For centuries, moon phases were thought to influence everything from planting crops to preserving food. This practice dates back to ancient agricultural societies, where the waxing and waning moon was believed to impact moisture levels in plants, and, by extension, the success of canning. The logic was very simple. If the moon could pull the tides, surely it had a say in how your peaches stayed fresh. Cultural traditions played a huge role in this belief. Many rural communities swore by canning during a waxing moon, believing it improved shelf life and reduced spoilage. Modern science hasn't found much evidence to back it up, but let's face it, early homemakers didn't exactly have access to food safety manuals or pressure gauges. They relied on intuition, folklore, and a healthy dose of trial and error. While these ideas may sound charmingly archaic, they highlight a time when resourcefulness met ritual. And even if the moon itself wasn't the secret ingredient, following its phases might have helped people plan their canning schedules around harvests and weather patterns. Decades ago, when household ingenuity met limited resources, some home canners turned to an unexpected ally: aspirin. Yes, the same pill you'd take for a headache found its way into jars of preserved vegetables and fruits. This practice emerged during the mid-20th century, particularly in times of economic hardship, when canning supplies like vinegar or proper sealing equipment weren't always accessible. Aspirin, with its acetyl salicylic acid, was thought to inhibit bacterial growth, making it a convenient stand-in for traditional preservatives. The cultural significance of this method speaks to its era. It highlights a time when people prioritized resourcefulness over rigid science. If aspirin could keep you on your feet through a flu season, why couldn't it keep your pickles crisp? While it may have seemed effective, modern experts agree that aspirin doesn't do enough to prevent the growth of harmful bacteria, like the kind that causes botulism. Despite its impracticality by today's safety standards, this quirky workaround underscored the importance of making do with what was available. Storage and shelf life, however, were a gamble, likely more dependent on luck than aspirin's chemical properties. In the world of traditional canning, attention to detail was everything, even down to the way jar lids were prepared. For generations, home canners swore by boiling lids separately before sealing their jars. This method was a ritual, rooted in the belief that heating the rubber seal would soften it and ensure a tighter, more secure fit. The practice dates back to the early 20th century when commercial canning supplies became more widely available. Back then, ensuring a proper vacuum seal was crucial, especially when refrigeration was a luxury, not a household standard. Boiling lids separately was a practical safeguard against spoilage, but it also reflected a time when every jar of food represented hours of hard work and an investment in the family's survival through lean seasons. While this technique was widely accepted, it wasn't without challenges. Timing was everything. Too much heat and the rubber could warp. Too little and you risked a failed seal. Fast forward to today, and modern canning lids come pre-treated, with manufacturers advising against boiling them. A simple rinse in hot water now does the trick. Long before modern jar lids and their rubber gaskets became standard, home canners relied on a surprisingly simple trick: grease. A thin layer of fat, often lard or tallow, was applied to the rims of jars to create an airtight seal. This technique wasn't just a clever improvisation. It was born out of necessity in an era when specialized canning tools were hard to come by, and every kitchen operated with a "use what you've got" mentality. The origins of this method date back to the 19th century, when preserving food often meant adapting whatever resources were available. Grease acted as a barrier, keeping out air and bacteria, which was critical for extending shelf life. While this might sound like a practical solution, it wasn't foolproof. The seal depended heavily on the consistency of the grease and how evenly it was applied. Too much, and you risked contamination. Too little, and spoilage was inevitable. Culturally, this method reflected a time when waste wasn't an option. Every scrap of fat was reused, from cooking to sealing jars, showcasing the ingenuity of earlier generations. Preserving fruit in alcohol was a flavorful tradition with roots stretching back centuries. Long before modern refrigeration, alcohol was a trusted preservative thanks to its natural ability to kill bacteria and prevent spoilage. This method was particularly popular in Europe during the 18th and 19th centuries, where spirits like brandy, rum, and even wine were used to extend the shelf life of seasonal fruits. From a practical perspective, this method was a win-win. Not only did it preserve fruit, but it also infused the alcohol with natural sweetness and flavor, making it a dual-purpose treat. Picture cherries soaked in brandy or peaches floating in a jar of bourbon, functional and indulgent. Plus, in a time when desserts weren't always readily available, these boozy fruits doubled as a sophisticated topping for cakes or a quick addition to holiday feasts. The challenges, however, weren't insignificant. Alcohol wasn't always affordable for everyone, and maintaining the right balance between fruit and liquid was crucial to ensure proper preservation. Too little alcohol and your batch could ferment. More science experiment than pantry staple. During the Great Depression and World War II, frugality was a necessity. Reusing commercial jars for home canning became a common practice as families stretched every resource. Pickle jars, mayonnaise jars, and even old peanut butter jars were cleaned, sterilized, and repurposed to store everything from jams to vegetables. It wasn't ideal, but when mason jars were in short supply, ingenuity took over. This practice had its benefits. Reusing jars was cost-effective and environmentally friendly long before reduce, reuse, recycle became a mantra. But it wasn't without risks. Commercial jars, designed for single use, were often thinner and more prone to cracking under the high heat of pressure canning. One wrong move, and your carefully preserved peaches could end up on the kitchen floor, or worse, in the garbage. Culturally, this speaks to a time when waste was unthinkable. Every item was reused, repurposed, or repaired, showcasing a resourcefulness that feels foreign in today's disposable culture. Storage and shelf life depended on how well the jars held up, but reusing them wasn't always a guarantee of success. Modern canning discourages this practice for safety reasons, but the spirit of resourcefulness lives on. Back in the day, when canning was more art than science, hot wax preservation was a go-to method for sealing jams and jellies. This technique involved pouring melted paraffin wax directly onto the surface of the food to create an airtight barrier. It was mesmerizing to watch the wax harden and form a protective seal. First popularized in the early 20th century, this method reflected a time when preserving food required creativity and a touch of chemistry. While simple and inexpensive, the challenges of hot wax preservation quickly became apparent. The wax seal could crack if mishandled, inviting air and bacteria inside, a recipe for disaster. And let's not forget the sheer mess of trying to remove hardened wax when it came time to enjoy the preserves. Still, for generations of home canners, this method was a symbol of self-reliance. After all, if you couldn't afford fancy lids, wax offered an affordable solution. Culturally, this method carried significance as a family tradition. Many of us can still picture jars of jam lined up in our grandparents' pantries, each topped with a glistening layer of wax. Today, hot wax preservation has been retired in favor of safer techniques, but it serves as a reminder of how innovation, and a little paraffin, helped keep pantries stocked. In the early days of jam and jelly making, copper pots were prized for more than their gleaming appearance. Their conductive properties allowed for precise heat control, essential when cooking fruit and sugar to the perfect consistency. But here's where things get interesting. Copper was believed to help preserve the vibrant colors of the fruit, ensuring your strawberry jam looked as good as it tasted. This technique dates back centuries, with copper cookware commonly used in European kitchens long before the advent of modern canning tools. From a practical standpoint, copper's ability to heat evenly made it a favorite among home preservers, especially for delicate fruits that could scorch easily in uneven heat. However, copper pots weren't without their challenges. If the pot wasn't lined or treated properly, the metal could react with the acid in the fruit, leading to off flavors, or worse, potential toxicity. Culturally, these pots were often heirloom pieces, passed down through generations, carrying not just the recipes, but the history of family traditions. Modern updates, like stainless steel and non-reactive cookware, have largely replaced copper for safety and convenience, but the charm of those bright, shiny pots still holds a special place in culinary history. In the world of pickling, grape leaves have long been the secret weapon for keeping pickles crisp. This trick has roots in ancient food preservation practices, particularly in regions where grapevines thrived, like the Mediterranean and Eastern Europe. The leaves contain natural tannins, which help maintain the firm texture of pickled vegetables, especially cucumbers. Think of them as nature's way of saying, "Nobody likes a soggy pickle." The technique was both practical and ingenious. A single leaf added to the jar worked wonders in preventing cucumbers from softening during fermentation. In a time before modern additives, this method showcased how early preservers tapped into local resources to solve culinary challenges. Culturally, grape leaves carried significance in cuisines around the world. Whether stuffed for dolmas or tucked into pickle jars, they were a versatile ingredient that symbolized resourcefulness. Not every region had access to grapevines, and not all grape varieties had the same tannin content, making it a bit of a trial-and-error process. Modern picklers often skip the grape leaves in favor of commercial crisping agents, but for those who love a nod to tradition, this simple, natural method still holds its charm. In the art of syrup making, egg whites were once the go-to tool for achieving crystal-clear results. This age-old technique, which dates back centuries, involved whisking egg whites into the hot syrup mixture. As the syrup simmered, the egg whites would coagulate, binding to impurities and forming a foam that could be skimmed off, leaving behind a clear, refined product. This method originated in European kitchens, where clarity was a mark of quality. Whether for fruit syrups, jellies, or even beverages like mead, clarity signaled craftsmanship. But as ingenious as this technique was, it wasn't without its challenges. Timing was critical. Leave the egg whites in too long, and you risked scrambled eggs in your syrup. And while effective, the process could be labor-intensive, requiring constant attention and a watchful eye. Today, modern filtration systems and commercial clarifiers have mostly replaced the need for egg whites, but the principle remains the same. Before refrigerators and pantries were household staples, storing canned goods underground was the ultimate preservation hack. Root cellars, as they were commonly called, were a practical solution for keeping food fresh and accessible. The idea was simple but brilliant. Take advantage of the Earth's naturally cool and stable temperatures to extend the shelf life of canned fruits, vegetables, and preserves. This practice dates back centuries, with early settlers and rural families relying on underground storage to survive harsh winters. The preservation technique worked because the constant, cool environment slowed bacterial growth and minimized spoilage. It was also a resourceful way to protect food from sunlight, which could degrade both nutrients and flavor. Families often dug cellars near their homes, carefully organizing shelves of canned goods alongside potatoes, onions, and other root vegetables. Culturally, these storage spaces symbolized self-sufficiency and planning. A well-stocked root cellar was a badge of honor, a testament to a family's ability to prepare for the unknown. However, digging and maintaining these spaces came with challenges. They required the right soil conditions, proper ventilation, and occasional pest proofing. In the days before electric and gas stoves, wood stoves were the backbone of home canning operations. These heavy-duty appliances served not only as a heat source for cooking and warming homes, but also as the workhorses for heat processing jars. The origins of this practice go back to the 19th century, when canning began gaining popularity in rural areas. With wood readily available, it was a practical solution for families preserving the harvest. Using a wood stove for heat processing required precision and patience. Maintaining a consistent temperature was no small feat, as it depended on feeding the fire just the right amount of fuel. Too little, and the jars wouldn't seal properly. Too much, and you risked cracked jars or overcooked contents. It was a delicate dance that turned every canning session into a test of both skill and endurance. Culturally, the wood stove was often the heart of the home, symbolizing hard work and self-reliance. Entire days were devoted to canning, with the stove working overtime and family members pitching in. Managing heat in the middle of summer made kitchens feel like saunas, and the constant attention required was anything but convenient. One of the most trusted methods for checking if a jar is sealed properly is the knuckle tap test. This simple technique dates back to the early days of home canning, when technology wasn't as advanced and canning wasn't a science. It was more of an art. After processing, the jar lids would be tapped gently with a knuckle. If the lid sounded hollow, it meant it had sealed correctly. If it made a dull thud, the seal hadn't taken, and the food inside was at risk. The knuckle tap method worked because the lid seal would make a distinct noise when it was vacuum sealed, a subtle but telling sound that home preservers had learned to recognize over time. It was a quick and easy way to ensure that jars were properly sealed before being stored. Of course, you couldn't rely on sound alone. A visual inspection and a bit of trial and error were often necessary to guarantee a good seal. While it was a reliable technique, it wasn't foolproof. Some jars were more stubborn than others, and occasionally the tap test would fail. But if you were lucky enough to hear that satisfying pop, it was a moment of pure satisfaction. Long before refrigerators and modern preservation techniques, saltwater baths were a go-to method for preserving vegetables. This age-old practice, rooted in ancient cultures, relied on salt's natural ability to draw out moisture and create an environment inhospitable to spoilage-causing bacteria. The process was simple. Vegetables like cucumbers, cabbage, and carrots would be submerged in a brine solution, often with additional spices for flavor. The salt in the water would prevent the growth of harmful microorganisms, allowing the vegetables to ferment and develop tangy flavors that many still cherish today, like in sauerkraut and pickles. Culturally, this technique was a staple in European and Asian kitchens, passed down from generation to generation. It was a way to preserve the bounty of the harvest and prepare for the lean winter months. However, saltwater baths required careful attention to salt ratios and water levels to prevent spoilage. And of course, it wasn't the quickest method. Fermentation could take weeks. Today, brining still holds a special place in modern kitchens, with many home cooks returning to this old-world technique for its flavor and historical charm. Before glass jars dominated kitchen shelves, metal tins were often used for home canning, especially in the 19th and early 20th centuries. The practice of using metal containers was largely driven by practicality. Tin and other metals were inexpensive, durable, and easy to seal. This made them a perfect choice for home canning, even before the arrival of more sophisticated canning technology. To preserve food in metal tins, home canners would pack their vegetables or fruits tightly, heat the tins to sterilize the contents, and then seal them to create a vacuum. The sealed tins could then be stored in cool, dry places for long-term preservation. While practical, the use of metal tins posed its own challenges. For one, the cans needed to be completely airtight to prevent spoilage, which meant relying on hand crimping or rudimentary sealing machines. Plus, there was always the risk of rust if the tins weren't stored properly. Over time, glass jars began to take over, as they were easier to seal and offered better visibility of the contents. Today, metal tins have largely fallen out of favor for home canning, but they still have a nostalgic place in the hearts of many who remember their great-grandparents' pantries. Adding vinegar to tomatoes has been a go-to preservation technique for centuries, helping home canners preserve the summer harvest long after the growing season ended. Tomatoes, naturally acidic, were a perfect fit for the preservation power of vinegar. In the early days of canning, vinegar was often used in combination with salt and spices to create a brine that would keep tomatoes fresh and safe for consumption for months. The vinegar not only enhanced the flavor, but also provided the necessary acidity to prevent the growth of harmful bacteria, making it a key part of the preservation process. This method was particularly popular in the early 1900s when refrigeration was scarce and food preservation was a necessity. Along with home canning, many cultures embraced vinegar-soaked tomatoes for sauces, salsas, and even as a tangy snack. Culturally, this method reflects the resourcefulness of those who relied on homegrown vegetables to sustain them through the winter months. While modern canning methods are more streamlined and include advanced preservatives, the addition of vinegar still holds a special place in many kitchens for both its practicality and its nostalgic flavor. Long before refrigeration, preserving meat in lard was a clever way to extend its shelf life, especially during colder months. Lard, a rendered fat from pigs, acted as a natural preservative by creating an airtight seal around the meat. This method was used widely in the 19th and early 20th centuries, particularly in rural areas where access to refrigeration was limited. The fat would cover the meat completely, preventing exposure to air and, in turn, slowing down the decay process. Families who raised their own pigs would make use of every part of the animal, including the fat, to ensure nothing went to waste. Lard-preserved meats became staples in pantries, especially in colder climates, where it was too risky to rely on fresh food year-round. However, it wasn't all smooth sailing. The preservation process had its challenges. Keeping the lard at the right temperature and ensuring a proper seal were crucial to prevent spoilage. In addition, the greasy nature of lard could make storage a bit tricky, often requiring cool, dry places. While modern refrigeration and freezing have largely replaced this method, some still swear by the old technique for its ability to preserve flavor and texture. In the world of home canning, skipping the water bath was once considered a risky but resourceful shortcut. Traditionally, the water bath method involves submerging jars in boiling water for an extended period to create the necessary heat to seal them. However, some savvy canners, particularly in earlier times, opted to skip this extra step to save both time and fuel. This technique often relied on using high-acid foods, like tomatoes or fruit preserves, that could handle the heat without needing the extra assistance of a water bath. It also required the jar lids to be in perfect condition and the right sealing process to create an airtight seal. The idea was simple. If the food was acidic enough, the heat from the cooking process itself would be enough to ensure preservation. The practicality of skipping the water bath was especially appealing to families who needed to conserve resources, such as fuel or water. It was a sign of how people adapted their preservation techniques based on available resources. Without the water bath, the sealing process was more reliant on accuracy. If the jars weren't sealed just right, spoilage could quickly follow. Stacking jars during processing may sound like a canning misstep, but it was once a common practice born out of necessity. Back in the day, when canners had limited space and equipment, this technique was often used to maximize efficiency. Rather than spreading jars out in a water bath or canner, people would stack them on top of each other, creating a more compact and time-saving method of processing. The idea behind stacking jars was to preserve more food in less time, particularly during harvest seasons when preserving the bounty was essential. By stacking the jars, families could fit more into a single canning session, saving precious fuel and effort. However, it was a tricky balancing act. The jars had to be carefully arranged to ensure even heat distribution. If one jar at the bottom of the pile didn't get hot enough, the whole batch could be at risk of spoiling. Over time, modern canners have updated their practices to avoid stacking jars. Today's equipment is designed with better heat circulation in mind, making stacking unnecessary. But in the past, this method was a testament to the creativity and ingenuity of home canners. For centuries, salt has been used to test the freshness of eggs, an age-old trick passed down from one generation to the next. The method is simple but effective. When eggs are placed in a saltwater solution, fresh eggs will sink and lay flat on the bottom, while older eggs will float or stand upright. This clever test helps determine whether eggs are still good for recipes, especially when refrigeration was a luxury not everyone had. Before refrigeration, preserving eggs was a challenge. People would store eggs in cool places, often burying them in ash, lime, or, yes, salt to extend their shelf life. It's no surprise salt was an integral part of the process. It was affordable, abundant, and worked wonders for both preservation and testing. But even when eggs were fresh, they didn't always last as long as we might hope. With saltwater testing, you could quickly gauge whether eggs were still usable, ensuring you didn't end up with a cracked omelet or worse, an inedible dish. Today, while refrigeration has replaced much of this old-school preservation, the saltwater test is still a handy and reliable trick in the kitchen, especially if you don't trust your memory or those grocery store sell-by dates. Before the era of modern canning lids, many households had to get creative with how they sealed jars for preservation. One of the most resourceful methods was using cloth tied with string. It might seem unconventional today, but during the 19th and early 20th centuries, it was a popular and effective way to keep food sealed and protected from the elements. The cloth acted as a breathable cover, allowing gases to escape while still creating a protective seal over the jar. This was especially useful for preserving jams, pickles, and other goods that didn't require the airtight seal we now rely on. The cloth was usually tightly secured with a string or twine, keeping it in place as the contents were stored for later use. While this method was practical and effective, it did come with its own challenges. For one, it didn't offer the same level of security as the metal lids we use today, meaning there was always the risk of spoilage if the seal was imperfect. But in a time when every resource had to be stretched to its limit, this method allowed families to store food for longer periods, making it a valuable technique for self-sufficiency. Long before the advent of artificial flavorings, many cultures turned to nature for their culinary enhancements. One surprising source was tree bark. Yes, bark from certain trees like cinnamon and sassafras was used not just for its medicinal properties but also for flavoring food. Cinnamon, derived from the inner bark of the cinnamomum tree, has been prized for thousands of years, with origins tracing back to ancient Egypt. Its warm, sweet, and spicy notes were essential in everything from desserts to savory dishes. Sassafras bark, on the other hand, was used by Native Americans for its unique, slightly sweet flavor and its inclusion in recipes like root beer. The beauty of these bark-based enhancers was their versatility and availability. Rather than relying on expensive imports or complex methods of preservation, cultures could harvest bark sustainably, often in the wild. The shelf life of such natural flavorings was impressively long if dried properly, making them a staple in pantries. But like all natural preservation methods, using tree bark came with its challenges, especially in terms of consistency. The flavor could vary depending on the tree's age or the season, making it a bit of a gamble. In the world of food preservation, nothing beats the ingenuity of the past. Take, for instance, the clever practice of reusing old rubber seals, something many homemakers swore by. Before the days of easy access to replacement seals, reusing those old rubber rings became a necessity. These seals, typically used for canning jars, were the key to creating an airtight seal and locking in freshness. Historically, it was a practical solution born out of necessity. With rubber seals not as readily available as today, people would carefully clean and reuse them, ensuring the food inside the jars stayed fresh for longer. For many, it was a matter of resourcefulness and sustainability, especially during the war years when every penny counted and wasting food was out of the question. However, reusing seals had its challenges. Over time, the rubber could lose its elasticity, compromising the seal's effectiveness. A jar that wasn't properly sealed could lead to spoiled food, which was not just disappointing, but wasteful. Despite these risks, many homemakers learned to inspect seals carefully, stretching their lifespan by keeping them clean and replacing them when necessary. Before the invention of electric canners, there was an innovative method that relied on something as simple as sunlight: sun canning. A practice dating back to the late 1800s, it was a way of preserving fruits and vegetables using nothing more than the natural heat of the sun. The process involved placing jars filled with fruits, vegetables, or jams in a sunny spot, where the warmth would slowly cook and seal the contents. While this method didn't involve the same level of heat processing as modern canning, it still created a seal strong enough to preserve food for weeks or even months. Farmers and homesteaders across the country relied on it, especially in areas where fuel for cooking was scarce or expensive. Sun canning was incredibly weather-dependent, with results varying depending on how much sun was available. The most significant concern was that if the jars weren't properly sealed, spoilage could occur quickly. But for those with a resourceful spirit, sun canning was a valuable way to make the most of seasonal produce. Now, who could ever forget Campbell's soup? This is a household staple if I've ever heard of one, and it's a pretty magical thing when you think about it from the boomer's perspective. Today, we're spoiled. Let's face it, we are. We walk up to a store and get anything we want packaged, canned, or frozen, but all these goodies started somewhere, and Campbell's Soup was one of the most popular and long-lasting brands to do it. It had this condensed soup that just needed water or milk added and came in accessible flavors like cream of mushroom, chicken noodle, and tomato. The range with this thing was insane. Did you know you could even use this soup as the base for a casserole or as its sauce? And all that for just 10 to 12 cents. Pretty good steal, right? Considering it wasn't just a meal, it was a lifesaver for busy moms and a comforting staple for families during tough times. The iconic red and white can became a symbol of good food, finding a place in nearly every pantry. Campbell's ads even taught clever recipes like turning cream of mushroom soup into a creamy pasta sauce or a gravy for meatloaf. Kraut juice. It's just what it sounds like. During the Great Depression, fermented cabbage brine was a go-to pantry item, prized for its versatility and surprising nutritional benefits. It was a byproduct of sauerkraut making, and wasting it was out of the question. Straight down the throat for its purported health benefits as a cooking liquid for soups and stews, or even as a splash to bland foods to add flavor. Basically, it was the Depression-era version of an electrolyte drink, thought to help digestion and keep people going when fresh produce was scarce. But the taste was divisive. You either loved it or learned to tolerate it. Kraut juice had its good points too. It was cheap, it kept forever, and it was surprisingly rich in vitamins and probiotics. It was a lifeline in a jar for families with limited resources. Kraut juice has faded from the household staple, but it hasn't gone away altogether. Some old-school recipes still use it, and occasionally it's sipped as a health tonic. For the people who lived through the Great Depression, Kraut juice wasn't a health trend. It was a necessity. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked, one briny sip at a time. Something that is ridiculously common in Southeast Asian households in America, but a little less known to natives of Uncle Sam's residence, is that rinsing your rice with water can do wonders for any dish. Literally, any dish that involves even the slightest hint of rice. This is because rinsing removes the extra starch packed into rice, giving you fluffier grains with minimal effort. If you are the type of person who enjoys their rice soft, airy, and mushy, then this is one kitchen hack you need to try. This time, you can thank brown grandmas for passing it on to the mainstream. Even culinary scientists like Matt Slem vouch for this. And just like with sticky pasta, nobody enjoys eating sticky rice. Oatmeal cakes are a warm, fuzzy childhood dish that many might associate with visits to their grandparents. Failing economy on one side and grandma spoiling her favorite niece and nephew on the other. You just know they will always find a way. And lucky enough for us that the people of the times did it so craftily. In 35 minutes, you had a wondrous dessert to yourself that was quick enough to make after long, panic-filled days. Canned oatmeal on a soft cake glazed with an almond or peanut topping really set hearts on fire. Despite the cake's popularity back then, especially in the fitness and health community, it still did not stand the test of the time. Of course, it is a great way to spice up your oatmeal, regardless of how other breakfasts prepared with more culinary liberties taken would eventually replace it. Real quick, if you're loving this content as much as we loved making it, hit subscribe to stay connected and help us reach even more amazing folks like you. Feeling like your taste buds aren't being represented so far? Don't worry, we have a can for everyone, even the pickiest of eaters. This time around, we're going to talk about the miracle that is canned rice pudding. Sweet, creamy, and topped with just the perfect amount of cinnamon, vanilla, or nutmeg. This was the definition of a no-effort meal. I'm not joking around when I say all you needed to do was grab a spoon and rip that can open. As far as desserts went, it was pretty hard to compete with this 20-cent wonder and how much of a chokehold it had on the market. You could make more fancy desserts out of it, or you could just stick to the rice pudding, but for $1, you had pretty much your entire family fed. See, that's the economy we signed up for when we thought I'd grow up and get a job. I get that we can't print more money and all, but is bringing back affordable rice pudding too much to ask? Sometimes being a boomer doesn't sound so bad. What about you? Think you'd settle down in another era if you could savor all the food we don't have anymore? Canned liver wasn't the most comfortable food, but it was a lifeline during the Great Depression. This pantry staple was a nutritional powerhouse, packed with protein, vitamins, and minerals, and didn't require refrigeration, a godsend for families without access to fresh meat. It was metallic and mushy, but on a day when every calorie mattered, canned liver did the trick. The canned liver was a surprisingly versatile food. It could be spread on bread for a quick meal, mixed into casseroles, or fried up with onions to make something almost palatable. Its rich flavor, sometimes too rich, made it a cheap way to feed a family because a little went a long way. Canned liver can even be blended into meatloaf or meatballs, stretching meals without sacrificing protein for those willing to get creative. Canned liver is a rare thing today, but its legacy lives on as a symbol of frugality and resilience. It wasn't about taste or presentation for Depression-era families, it was about survival. A tin of canned liver in the cupboard was evidence that even the most unappealing ingredients could keep you alive and give you hope when things got the toughest. The typical scrambled eggs breakfast has been more or less a national tradition for so many years, it is impossible to tell where it really started. Low-key, small-time diners, high-tier French-American restaurants, and steakhouses all serve some kind of variation on eggs, including scrambled-ons. Hence, what do you do to add a little bit of variety, texture, and a bit of spaz to this classical option? If mayonnaise can work wonders for a burger, why not try it here? No, seriously, you'd be surprised. We know most people never make the link between eggs and mayo, but they can actually make them so much more fluffier and add this nice creamy texture too. If you do not believe us, then just search up any grandma's recipe for mayo eggs. Do not knock it till you try it. Boiled carrot sandwiches was created from the weird culinary gap left by increasing prices and thinner savings accounts. Like we said, people wanted vegetables that ticked the cheaper and tastier most boxes for them. However, even that was getting tough. Some of the worst stretches of the Great Depression left people with frustrations and creativity alike. Whipping up dishes like this was common, and the boiled carrot sandwich definitely stayed during the time because of its simplicity. Americans love a good sandwich, and they adore an easy-to-cook filling. Boiled carrot sandwiches definitely met most of the criteria, as roasting cheese to create an open-faced sandwich was a popular choice. Suffering the same fate as other dishes on this list, the The boiled carrot sandwich eventually died out as economic growth increased in America. One of the most classic street foods of all times is now coming to a supermarket near you in a can. At least, that's the branding they were going for with hot dogs. These pre-cooked bad boys were made with every kind of variation you could want to satisfy your hot dog craving. Pork fan? Got you covered. Chicken sausages, more your style? Have no fear, every can for chump change. Want to keep it strictly American and traditional with some beef? They have that too. They also doubled as party treats because you could go all out with pigs in a blanket or cocktail hot dogs. Canned hot dogs were really a part of the culture. And I don't mean that just because the first thing you think of when you hear the word American is somebody with a hot dog next to them. See, before this, hot dogs were something that were really beloved but were still something you had to either go out for or spend some time preparing and cooking. As a result, on those lazy days, they could never break past the barrier and reach real comfort food status. That was true until canned hot dogs came along and changed the entire game up. The popularity of sausage-based dishes spiked in popularity. It wasn't just hot dogs, but they definitely benefited the highest. People were having more hot dogs than ever before, and they were not being shy about their love of it either. The Depression-era workhorse of the pantry was cracked wheat, which turned simple grains into meals that fed body and soul. This unassuming staple was cheap, hearty, and endlessly adaptable, a lifeline for families trying to stretch a dollar. Cracked wheat was boiled into a porridge-like breakfast, used in place of pricier grains in bulk soups, or simply used as a cheap alternative to pricier grains. This coarse, nutty grain wasn't just filling, it was packed with nutrition, providing a steady supply of fiber, protein, and vitamins. It stored beautifully in burlap sacks, ready to rescue meals when other ingredients ran out, and its long shelf life made it ideal for stockpiling. Cracked wheat was baked into bread or stuffed into vegetables to make a hearty dinner. In fact, it was used to stretch ground meat in patties or meatloaves, so a little meat went a long way. Cracked wheat doesn't enjoy the spotlight these days, but it's a staple in many cuisines around the world, and so its staying power is proven. It wasn't a trendy health food back in the 1930s. It was survival on a plate. Cracked wheat, chewy and cracked, tasted of resilience and making do with what you had in every bite. Here's a patty grilling technique endorsed by the culinary virtuoso himself, Gordon Ramsay. You get some nice beef patties perfectly shaped, seasoned, and ready to be slapped onto the grill for the most divine homemade burger you have had in the past 5 years. Turns out it was a bit too humid, the meat was a little dry, and the grilling took away all the moisture. You end up with a dry, chewy patty that does neither your teeth nor your taste buds any favors. So what's an honest burger lover to do? Put some ice cubes on that bad boy and let it grill. You will genuinely be shell-shocked at the results. The whole thing here is that it keeps that moisture locked into the patty, so the burger stays constantly juicy throughout the process, from the moment you put it on the grill to the moment it hits your plate. It is not like you have anything to lose by trying except like 4 ice cubes, so give this a shot. And remember, you can always take Ramsay's word for it too. Milk toast is exactly what the name suggests. Toasted to perfection bread dipped in milk with a generous slap of butter. On days when any meal you loved was unaffordable and getting up to cook something proper was dreadful, milk toast came through for many families. All you needed was some good fresh bread and a warm glass of milk to gorge on until you felt full. Milk toast quickly became one of the most popular breakfasts in the States, catering specifically to people below the poverty line who could not make most of the items on this list regularly. Nowadays, this might be considered a very vintage meal, the type to get kids asking you what century you might be from. But back then, it was something even working-class 20-year-olds would eat daily. Times have changed, and the breakfast of people in those socioeconomic classes is definitely different. Now, take me seriously when I say this, but you could get canned or bottled chocolate milk too. I know that's not exactly new information because you can still get it, but what you might be surprised to know is that your mom and dad at 30-something were still more likely than not avid chocolate milk enjoyers. You can hold that one over their head next time they tell you to eat like an adult when you walk in with some Dr. Pepper or cereal for breakfast. This was just as good as any chocolate milk you could at home, and it cost just a few cents. The powdered alternatives were even more affordable, but they didn't have that same magic that the canned ones did. These really were deliciously sweet, and I don't know if they actually used a lot of chocolate, but most of the companies I tried that were popular in the boomer era really had a strong cocoa flavor. It's hard to imagine something as simple as eggs without a chicken coop, but during the Great Depression, powdered eggs were a reality. These dehydrated wonders became a staple in American homes, providing a protein-rich solution that didn't spoil and didn't require refrigeration. Powdered eggs could sit on a pantry shelf for months, unlike fresh eggs, and that was a godsend for families facing uncertainty. When you mixed powdered eggs with water, you got something that was like scrambled eggs, kind of. Powdered eggs were bland and grainy, but when there were no other options, powdered eggs did the trick. They weren't just for breakfast. Home cooks used them in baked goods, soups, casseroles, and even puddings. Powdered eggs were versatile enough that even the least equipped kitchen could create quite a number of dishes without a single cluck in sight. Cheap powdered eggs were available, and they were a favorite item for government relief programs, which made them available to struggling families. Their utility extended beyond homes. Powdered eggs were shipped overseas to soldiers during World War II to make sure troops were nourished even in the most remote locations. Powdered eggs are now a must in emergency kits and camping supplies, but during the Great Depression, they were a sign of resilience. Too much raisins can be pretty bad for you, despite what clickbait articles on the internet or Instagram info dumps will have you believe, unless you cook them the right way, which is by soaking them in some hot water before you get to baking. Something you must have noticed by now, whether we are dealing with fried chicken and pizza or rice and ground beef patties, is that every kind of food has the potential to get significantly better depending on the prep. If you just take a little bit of time out to add some things, soak them, place them in a proper container, and try a few hacks, then you can find yourself having a much better dish. In this case, the hot water makes them plumpier and amps up their properties as a natural laxative. You the type to struggle with digestion? This is a hack for you, plus all the other benefits like taming your sweet cravings or boosting your bone strength. Seems like Grandma really did know what was best for our bodies. Egg drop soup for some royal courts was a show of a chef's skill. In 1930, America the soup became a beloved soup of the masses who were struggling to make an honest paycheck. Bread from last night and eggs beaten so thoroughly that the preparation itself doubled as a forearm workout resulted in an incredibly rich soup. Sometimes, if a home cook felt particularly fancy, they would have chicken either boiled or shredded in the mix. Using the chicken stock was also a common way to not let anything go to waste, since getting the most bang for your buck out of poultry became a habit of everyone. Most would just have this with eggs and throw in some ginger, chives and olives, or anchovies. We would definitely like to see this make a comeback with a less cost-oriented version that really explores the dish. Golden syrup is this really thick sugar syrup that is pretty accurately named because, wow, this thing has a vibrantly strong amber hue. That kind of fits the taste of the syrup too. When I see amber-colored things, especially sweet ones, my mind goes straight to caramel. Does that happen for you too? We'd both be right though, since the syrup was caramel-flavored. It also had a sweetener that really sealed the whole deal together, wrapped in a neat little bow. You could use this for so many things, like making your porridge a bit more lively with this, adding it to desserts for some extra oomph, or using it as a drizzle over buttermilk pancakes. The possibilities covered breakfast, lunch, and dinner, so you can see why every boomer's home had this in their pantry. A lot of easy and no-fuss baking recipes like flapjacks and tarts were pretty much reliant on this syrup, and for good reason too. This thing really tasted amazing. I never knew fat could be the unsung hero of the Great Depression. Sweet, the solid white fat from the loins or kidneys of sheep and cows, was much more than a pantry staple. It was a survival tool. Sweat was once prized for its versatility, being used in cooking, baking, and even non-food uses such as making candles and soap. When resources were scarce and people had to make the most of every morsel, it was the original all-in-one solution. Sweat was a game-changer in the kitchen. It gave the dishes of meat pies, puddings, and dumplings richness, which helped to make them hearty enough to stretch a meal for an entire family. During the colder months when energy reserves were important, its high-calorie content made it essential. Suet wasn't just for savory dishes either, with recipes like suet pudding turning this otherwise savory staple into a sweet one. In addition to its utility, suet was available. It was often considered a byproduct by butchers and sold cheaply, so even the most cash-strapped families could afford it. It was also easy to render and store and kept for months when properly handled. Suet has pretty much disappeared from modern kitchens, but it occasionally makes an appearance in traditional recipes. It was more than just fat to those who lived through the Great Depression. It was a lifeline in lard's clothing. This is probably no surprise to a lot of people who grew up having mac and cheese at their grandma's house or from a street cart down the block. Just a little bit of mustard in your mac and cheese can do wonders for taking an already perfect dish and kicking it up several notches, but the question is, why? What does mustard do to mac and cheese that makes this pairing so irresistible that every vendor, grandma, and home chef from the Midwest to the northern areas tries it? It is because the acidity of the mustard really helps cut through all the fat in the macaroni and cheese and blends together with the flavor already there. You can find this in just about any grocery store too if you check the back of the box. Classic Dijon or yellow mustard adds that tang that makes your mac and cheese shine and stand out. Cabbage and noodles typically just looked like a pound of cabbage and a medium serving of noodles. More or less, it was not the most expensive dish, and you could enjoy a bowl by making it pretty quickly. Away from the pancake and pie-addled fanatics or admirers of noodles across the states, everyone needs their cravings satisfied from time to time, even if the soaring prices spared no one. In some areas, cabbage and noodles was known as haluski. However, in most places, it was simply referred to as cabbage and noodles, the most typical Depression-era noodle recipe. It's a must-have that needed to be in your repertoire if you were to survive the times and not forget every taste you ever loved. Someone really needs to study how times like these bring out everyone's culinary creativity. Next, we're going to look at a classic for coastal cities, which is some old-fashioned canned sardines. Usually, the cans would be filled with oil, water, sauces, mustard, or tomatoes, and they had a lot of flavor and health benefits. You could get some really vivid and salty fish that also happened to be full of omega-3, making your lank account only slightly lighter and your body 10 times fresher. Plus, the best part about fish like this was just how easy it was to make it and all the things you could do with it. You could steam the fish, boil it, or even grill it and fry it. If that wasn't up your alley, then you could just eat it with crackers, make a sardine sandwich, or even dice it up and use it as a pizza topping or in a salad. People even used sardines in pasta, and I don't know about you, but I think that covers most of what we eat in our daily lives. All that for just 10 cents? Sign me up. Plus, sardines were arguably the most common catch of the day. That explains why they're so cheap. But it also meant that this was a taste pretty much everyone had acquired over years and years of eating them, so not only was it cheap and good, it was familiar and nostalgic. Real comfort food vibes, you know? Pickled vegetables were the ultimate solution for long-term nourishment when fresh produce was a fleeting luxury. Families in the Great Depression knew how to make their gardens work overtime, and pickling was a go-to way to stretch the harvest into lean winter months. If it grew, it could be pickled. Cucumbers, green beans, cabbage, and even watermelon rinds were preserved in tangy brine. The process was simple but ingenious. Jars were packed with vegetables, vinegar, salt, and spices to become shelf-stable pantry stars. Preserving food with pickling didn't just preserve the food, it elevated it. Pickled vegetables gave sharp, zesty flavors to otherwise bland meals, bringing a taste of summer to the dead of winter. Pickling was more than a food preservation method. It was a communal activity. Neighbors swapped jars, families shared brine recipes, and pickling became a way to connect during hard times. Nothing was wasted. Even scraps that would have otherwise been discarded had a second life in the pickle jar. Real quick, if you're loving this content as much as we loved making it, hit subscribe to stay connected and help us reach even more amazing folks like you. Pickled vegetables are a trendy addition to charcuterie boards these days. But during the Depression, they were a necessity. But for families who were barely making ends meet, a pantry full of jars of pickled vegetables wasn't just a source of food, it was a source of pride and security. If starch holds things like pasta and rice together and rinsing it out gives you nicely separated grains and fluffy pasta, what happens when you add starch back in? Well, exactly what you would think. Potatoes are a great source of starch, and adding them to any kind of soup, stew, or broth would help thicken the consistency exponentially. If you are not the type to enjoy thin, clearer broths, then adding mashed potatoes into your cauldron will help a lot. As the potatoes cook, they end up releasing starch, which holds the soup together much better, giving it a velvety texture that feels great with every spoonful. If you don't feel like going the extra mile with all the prep mashed potatoes require, don't worry. You can always just add in some instant potato flakes for relatively the same effect. Remember, the name of the game this time is starch, not the potatoes themselves, though they make a great side to any broth. Vinegar pie is the rather odd dish on this list that proves that at times of desperation, anyone will eat anything. Vinegar pie started spreading infectiously out of states like Pennsylvania in the start of the 1930s and tops even dandelion salad when it comes to being budget-friendly. All you would need is an open crust, vinegar, sugar, and some eggs to create this unique pie. To cover the mediocre taste, people would coat the crust with a meringue. It was an affectionate treat to bring in case of a celebration and was easy to make if you had a sweet craving. The dish was also pretty delicious if you were able to get over the sour vinegar taste and focus on the meringue. People really wanted a sweet treat at the end of a hard week spent cutting corners and working long hours, and small joys like vinegar pies were what kept people sustained. As goofy as this name sounds, and please bear with me because I really can't say spork and speef without chuckling, it was actually a legit idea for an afternoon lunch. Before that though, let's get into what it is. Spork is basically just canned processed pork, and beef is exactly the same. But beef? I want whoever named these to win some kind of award. I'm not even sure if there's a category for best product names out there, but if there is, this guy should win. Luckily for this, the name wasn't the only thing it had going for it. It was really a lot like Spam, and it was affordable, easy to take around with you in your bag, and even easier to prepare since it was all pre-made. We're going to go into it in detail later, but this was really similar in texture and taste to Spam, just minus the tropical elements. It was a shelf staple. If you had a can of this and 2 slices of bread, you could pretty much make a sandwich today. See all those 10-step sandwich recipes on TikTok that ask you to go get a giant loaf of bread? Out with that, in with this. Bring back convenient sandwich making. Plus, speef and spork were really good because they were so versatile. It was even a competitor to Spam because you could pretty much pair this with any classic breakfast or dish that was typical for Americans and get to eating. It was a great way to liven up some meals that were otherwise good but had gotten pretty monotonous thanks to being such regular mainstays at American tables. Speef was definitely the better option for families though, since it was a mix of beef and pork sometimes as well. You could make some banger casseroles off of this. During the Great Depression, corn syrup wasn't just a sweetener, it was liquid gold. It was cheap, endlessly versatile, a pantry staple that helped stretch sugar supplies and satisfy sweet cravings when dessert options were slim. Corn syrup was a baking ingredient, but it was also a problem-solving ingredient. It sweetened oatmeal, preserved fruits, replaced expensive honey or maple syrup, and even found its way into homemade candies and frostings. Corn syrup was the next best thing for families with a sweet tooth but no budget to indulge. One of its hidden talents? It also acts as a secret weapon in making food last longer. Jams and jellies were often made with corn syrup to keep them fresh for months. It also ended up in Depression-era classics like pecan pie or molasses cookies, where it gave simple ingredients a rich, gooey texture that made them seem decadent. Modern critics might snicker at corn syrup's nutritional downsides, but during the Depression, no one cared. It was cheap, it was plentiful, and it kept families fed. It was a small but meaningful taste of happiness for kids lucky enough to get a corn syrup-laced treat. Speaking of turnoffs, something that detracts from all the maritime goodness fish has to offer is that offensive odor that tends to come with most seafood you will catch. Funnily enough, soaking your fish in milk can quickly eliminate that issue. Look, there is no easy way to say it. It stinks, and it stinks bad. It is not something you would want with your food, much less constantly oozing out of your fridge every time you open it. Grandmas did know that fish is too essential of a superfood to just cut out of the diets of growing healthy kids, though. Naturally, they did what they do best and scoured the ends of the culinary world looking for a way to solve the problem. The answer was always much closer to them than they would think, almost right under their nose. When you soak fish in milk for about 20 minutes, it bonds with the protein in the milk and the compounds in the fish responsible for that ghastly smell stick with the beverage afterwards. When you extract it, you get a clean-tasting fish with none of that ridiculous funk. If you enjoyed today's video, make sure to like and subscribe, and let us know some of your canning tricks in the comments below.